warm welcome to everyone who's here, who can see me and hear me. My name is Claire Melamed, and in a moment we will kick off this session on data ecosystems. Very warm welcome to everybody to this session on building data ecosystems to solve our biggest challenges. Either one of those things is quite a big topic in itself, building ecosystems and solving the big challenges. And let me just say at the beginning that we have half an hour for this session. I can see the numbers of participants clicking up on the counter in the top right-hand corner of the hop-in screen. So let me just give colleagues a moment to enter the room. Still going up. Don't want anyone to miss anything. Okay. Very warm welcome to you all to this session on building ecosystems to solve our biggest challenges. My name is Claire Melamed. I'm the CEO of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. And data ecosystems is a very big thing for us. We work with partner governments around the world, mainly in Africa and Latin America. And our approach to working with those governments is entirely about building ecosystems, bringing institutions together within governments and bringing together the public and the private sectors to ensure that data can play its role in policy making and social progress around the world. But this is not about me, this session. This is about all of our speakers. We have a fantastic group of speakers today. For those who are looking at your program and we're planning to settle in for the whole hour, I have good news and bad news. The good news is this is a half an hour session. We will be ending on the hour. I'm sure there are people joining from around the world, so on the hour of whatever time zone you are in. This means that we will have a very focused discussion with all of our expert speakers here. It also means that you have an extra half an hour in your day. If you're like me in London, it's a beautiful day, so you could go for a short walk while you prepare for all the afternoon sessions of the summit. We're going to start thinking ecosystems obviously are very much on everybody's minds this week in particular, as all of us have half an eye, I think, on Glasgow and COP. And the idea of an ecosystem, an interconnected system of different institutions, different actors whose behavior is all interconnected, and where what one organization, what one person even does affects everybody else within the system. Something that clearly we're all thinking about this week in relation to environmental ecosystems. But I think as we think about data, the concept of an ecosystem is a relatively new one, and focusing much more on the relationships and the institutions that sit behind the data that we look at, the data that we use, is I think probably a relatively new but an incredibly useful concept. So why I want to start the discussion is just to think about that idea of a data ecosystem and to ask each of my colleagues in turn on this panel. First of all, I'd love to hear from you what a data ecosystem actually means to you. How would you define it? It's not something we've been talking about for long, so I'm sure different people have different ideas in their heads about what that is. And secondly, why is it a useful idea? How does thinking about data as part of an ecosystem help us to gather, to analyze, and to use data more effectively, ultimately to change the world, which is what we're all trying to do in ways big and small. So a few ideas there to really get us thinking about ecosystems. Simon, let me start with you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Claire, and good afternoon or good morning or good evening, wherever you are around the world. My name's Simon McLellan, and I'm head of data at the Met Office in the UK. And weather isn't constrained by borders and boundaries. It really does have that freedom of movement. And to predict the weather here in the UK, for example, it's essential to understand the current state of the weather in other places. And sometimes that is in other countries, what's coming our way from beyond our borders. And the 24/7 international exchange of weather data is something that global meteorological community has been incredibly successful at for many, many years. And that has been our data ecosystem, like-minded meteorological organizations around the world. But things are changing with advances in scientific understanding and technological capability. The demand for our data has seen sort of explosive growth. So anyone, small, medium enterprises, big tech companies, public sector, private sector, even talented individuals and members of the public can now access, process, combine, analyze, and use vast quantities of data. So our data at the Met Office isn't now something that we just turn into a forecast that you hear after the news, perhaps. It's data that can be consumed by algorithms and developers from across multiple sectors, not just those meteorological experts. So our data ecosystem for weather, and particularly, as you mentioned, COP, with our climate data as well, that data ecosystem for us is massively expanding now to include that user community that's looking at ingesting our weather and climate data into algorithms that can make some sort of beneficial impact and change. So for me, that's the sort of that ecosystem for data from my perspective is really expanding massively.
Thank you so much. So an ecosystem that includes users as well as producers, I think, is a really important way of thinking about this. Julie, let me turn to you next.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. I'm Julie Pearce from the Food Standards Agency, and for us, we start with thinking about the food ecosystem. You talked about COP and sustainability before, and food as a domain is absolutely vast, and it is again truly global. So for us, we start thinking about the food ecosystem. So it's not too great a leap to then think about all of the data that is there with the food, flowing with the food as the food moves through the system, the data that is there with people as they're making or consuming food. So it's not a huge sort of intellectual leap for people. The challenge is actually making it real, and that then becomes really, really hard. But I think the thought of us operating just within the FSA, within the sort of the boundaries of our organisation, it doesn't make any sense to anyone. But it's not an easy thing to do. And one of our connections to our super ecosystem is with Simon and team Weather. So that's just one of many places where the food ecosystem interacts with another one of these ecosystems.
Thank you so much. And I guess your ecosystem is also including a lot of private sector entities. So the companies, obviously, who are responsible for producing and transporting and selling all of our food. So it'd be interesting to come back, I think, to a kind of question about public and private actors within an ecosystem.
Very much so.
Vincenzo, let me turn to you now, please.
Thanks very much, Claire, and hello everyone. I'm Vincenzo Rampulla, and I work within Smart Data at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Most people won't have come across Smart Data yet, but a good way of explaining it is to the aim to replicate and expand the benefits and successes that open banking has had in the UK to other sectors of the economy. So our challenge is slightly different. So for us, the challenge of the ecosystem is to actually make and enable sectors to work together as different schemes for smart data grow and develop. When we've set out some principles to help us guide what we think the ecosystem needs to do and look like. You know, one of them is really about practically enabling interoperability between these different systems. And that's a challenge in itself. Kind of how do you do that practically and meaningfully? And then just to echo the point that Simon was making, getting the right range of voices around the table to inform that work. This is an evolving place. It's not clear how which route it's going to take and what it's going to look like even in a couple of years' time. So how do we get the right people around the table and the right feedback loops of information and understanding to help that evolve?
Thank you so much. So are you talking really here about a sort of data ecosystem that actually can be a factor in driving change rather than simply reflecting the state of play within a system?
That's absolutely right. So one of the challenges we've set ourselves for an ecosystem is that it really helps the system evolve through collaboration, but also just drawing together information from a range of sources to get a true picture of how things are developing and who's being affected and who's benefiting.
Thank you so much, though. And I think this idea of gathering data from so many different sources is a really critical thing that we get from thinking about an ecosystem, which perhaps we sort of was different to the way we thought about data before we began to have this much more systems approach. Alex, let me turn to you, and then Louisa finally.
Hello, yeah, I'm Alexandra Lennox, and I'm head of LawtechUK at TechNation. And LawtechUK is a government-backed initiative which is supporting the digital transformation of the legal sector. And we're doing that with a sort of diverse work program, but the main focus is obviously in supporting societies and businesses getting better legal support. And we see data as critical to that. So we're really focused around improving use and access to data, and therefore that sort of creation of an ecosystem is critical in supporting that. And we sort of see data ecosystems really focused actually around people and trust. So I know often we talk about infrastructure, but at least in our sort of quite regulated sector where there is a lot of fear, is sort of trust and the convening of people that is really important. And at least in the work we've done, we've sort of facilitated that through a sandbox environment. So this is sort of an R&D environment, which sort of innovation-led, but supported by the regulators and in a much broader network. So it really is that convening. And then the sort of sandbox provides that sort of safe space and that building of trust.
Thank you so much. No, I'm so glad you mentioned trust and people, human relationships, because while we tend to think in terms of institutions, of course, it's people that actually make up institutions, and we need to be thinking about people all the time in this, although in some ways the kind of language that we use sometimes can distract us from that. But thank you. I think that's such an important addition. Louisa.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Louisa Nolan, Chief Data Scientist at the Office for National Statistics, which I'm sure you're aware is the UK's biggest producer of national statistics. So we see data as a public good. Our goal is to make data available for people to use in decision-making, could be citizens, businesses, policymakers, and to make it available in a way that is well understood and that we have the best data available for people to make those decisions. So for us, the ecosystem is the whole process, all the way from when you start thinking about data, which is basically when I wake up in the morning, obviously. Traditionally, we've used surveys and, of course, the census at ONS, but more and more we're turning to third-party data, big data, alternative data, administrative data. It's really important then to work with the owners of those data to really understand it properly and to be able to use it. It's no good just flinging data across the wall and hoping to understand what it means. So we bring the data in, part of our ecosystem then is processing it. There is a lot around infrastructure and building people with the right skills to use the right infrastructure to take advantage of big data and data science so that we're on the cutting edge of what's available so we make the most of the data. And as we're doing that, thinking also about the legal and ethical issues, this is a really important part as well. It's not just the data, it's not just the technical bits. So building robust production, and then we make the last part of the ecosystem really making the data available through our published statistics, but also through things like the secure research service, which allows approved researchers to come and use the data at a more granular level. And the very exciting initiative that we have, that we're leading a cross-government initiative to build an integrated data service, which is by definition an ecosystem for data, which will bring together ready-to-use data to make data available more quickly and enable collaborative analysis for the public good. I think that bringing people together, people who understand the data, maybe people with the latest data science techniques, subject matter experts, policy people, bringing all of those people together to work on the data to get the best value out of it. And within that, making sure that the data is understood. So we've got good data standards, good metadata. There is no data set that's perfect, which is a sad event, but making sure people understand what you can use the data for and where you shouldn't really be using that data. So for us, a data ecosystem is quite big and complex, possibly not quite as big and complex as the whole of the climate, but there's still a lot of bits, people, partnerships, infrastructure and technology, and that legal and ethical side.
Thank you so much, Louisa. No, and I think that was a really, I think that sort of answer also gives us a flavour of the many different things that need to be thought about, the regulatory frameworks, the specific skills and capacities within an institution, the relationships between institutions, ultimately what's this for, who is the users, and so on. And I think that's really helpful. Now, We have more than 130 people listening to us, and from the questions that are coming in, I'm thinking that what they really want from this session, or at least some of them clearly, is quite practical advice on examples of good and bad. We've had a good question here about examples of good and bad data ecosystems that different sectors or organizations can look to for guidance on what to do, and obviously pitfalls to avoid. Also a question about the key to establishing an open data ecosystem. So just thinking about your own systems as you've really sort of helpfully described them, I think it'd be great to just think, you know, for the benefit of those in the audience who want to learn from your experiences, what are the biggest barriers that you've faced? All of your descriptions have been sort of, in a sense, how you want it to work, how you think it should, how it works on a good day, let's say. But on the less good days, what are the main barriers that you're facing that are preventing the system from really working as smoothly as you would like and being as useful as you would like? And what is the advice that you would offer to others trying to establish a useful data ecosystem in their particular area? Let me mix it up a little. We'll go back in the same order so that everyone has had a chance to think. Simon, let's start with you.
Thank you. Yeah, interestingly, I think one of the things I mentioned there was that traditional ecosystem of Met services around the world, so the Met Office in the UK, exchanging data with other Met services around the world. And just in the last couple of weeks, I've been involved in rewriting the data policy for that World Meteorological Organization. And the key fundamental part of that is reciprocity. You know, it's that exchange. It's exchange of data. You benefit from that international flow of data. We can only make our forecasts better by understanding what the ground truth is. And there are parts of the world where the sort of the infrastructure isn't available necessarily to gather observations of the weather at the same rate that you can in perhaps more developed parts of the world. And very much one of the things that the World Meteorological Organization is very keen on is leaving no Met service behind. You know, there's as much value in us understanding what the weather's doing on some small island state in the middle of the Pacific as there is for us understanding what it is in Paris. But the challenges of gathering that data are much different, and therefore that sort of community, that partnership of those organizations to be seeing the genuine benefit of supporting each of those member states to be sharing data. So I think for me, that sort of that community, that greater good, that reciprocity is so important. So by providing the rest of the world with observations, the benefit is you get accurate forecasts back again, and recognizing that what you get back from that is massively important. And then for us then as a community, I think the challenges, the things that we need, pitfalls that we might need to avoid, are where we're suddenly not sharing our data with other meteorological sort of experts. It's people like Julie in the Food Standards Agency. It's people like Louisa, where they're trying to do something really interesting with weather data, but they don't necessarily understand it in quite the same way that the weather nerds that I work with, I mean, the weather experts that I work with are familiar with. So our challenge is to make our data understandable and findable and usable and interoperable with other people's data sets, so that we can really get some value out of that, or we can allow others to get real value out of that data.
Thank you. So I think the key words there are reciprocity and interoperability. Yeah. Interesting to know what other words we add in the course of this discussion. Julie, over to you.
Yes, thank you. From experience, I think we at the Food Standards Agency started sort of with the data, thinking it was all about the data, and it was all about just making data open for its own sake, and open was good. I think where we are now is, yes, it's still all about the data, but we're actually spending much more time and effort in some of the things Simon was talking about, sort of stepping back a bit and thinking about what's in it for me. We may be talking to other government departments and people with similar sorts of objectives, but for a lot of the time we're talking with industry. And if they're not legally obliged to share their data, why should they? It's valuable, it's an asset, and they will treat it as such. So we then start to have, again, those conversations about reciprocity, and it can become quite challenging with people saying, I'm going to trust you and I'm going to take a risk by sharing this data with you, and what are you going to do with it? So I think those are some of the challenging conversations to be had, and those are conversations that we need to have all the time, because I think once people come in and they start, they then generally see value and engage and will trust more and more and will give more and more to the benefit of the overall system. And by that, I'm not talking about the data system, I'm talking about the food system. But it's just something you have to invest in all the time.
Thank you. So it's really the sort of common interests, I think, is the third idea to add there. I'm interested, and I'd be interested to hear from others. Both of you have talked about reciprocity and these sort of common interests. I'm interested in the kind of money flows that needs to underpin this. You know, when you talk about reciprocity between the Met Office and a tiny weather station in a small island in the Pacific, there's a huge imbalance there in resources. And similarly, as you mentioned, Julie, the private sector has a commercial interest here. Their data is valuable. So I'm really interested to hear from others, if you want to add anything on some of the kind of more material things that need to underpin these data systems. I think that would be a good addition here. Vincenzo.
Thanks. It feels like there's quite a lot of synergy in some of the challenges that others are speaking about, and it feels like there's quite a lot we could possibly learn from how those challenges have been met. Given smart data is slightly different in that it's a consumer-driven initiative that's enabling people to share data in order to get better services, increase competition. The challenges are slightly different. I'll give two very quick examples on both ends of the spectrum. One of the challenges is, how do you get different sectors to find common approaches to doing this in a way that's meaningful and enables that dreaded word interoperability to give it some practical force and kind of make a real world difference to consumers, and recognizing that it's an evolving picture as well. So how do you incorporate that in your system, your ecosystem? And on the other end of the spectrum, we're dealing with consumers, and it's a very consumer driven initiative. But how do you get them to echo what Alex was saying, kind of trusting that data sharing is both beneficial but also safe for them, and making sure they actively understand and can take control of what they're trying to do. So one of the things, as a kind of practical step, we found really useful is when we're talking to sectors to really kind of hone down on what are the use cases that you want to use data for. What is the offer to consumers that will enable them to think, oh, actually, this is worth doing? Because I think otherwise we get very conscious of talking about the data and the structures around it. And then if you don't have that thread of what do you want to do with it, it becomes quite a difficult conversation to move forward in.
Thank you. No, and I think, perhaps the new idea to add here is the idea of a sort of feedback loop. Somebody's mentioned on one of the Q&A the idea of accountability. So what are the feedback loops to users? What are the accountabilities that are being built into data ecosystems? That's really helpful. Thank you, Alex.
And yeah, building off that, I think at least some of the challenges we see in the legal sector around improving use and access to data and creating those ecosystems is the cultural elements already existing in the sector. So we're sort of very risk adverse in the legal sector, and there's a lot of fear. Possibly that's the same in all sectors and not unique to the legal sector. And often that is fueled by a lack of understanding, and we are a regulated sector. So I think there's a huge role regulators can play in overcoming some of those challenges. And going to, I guess, your interoperability point, a big challenge we see is around just the lack of good available data. Again, I'm sure this is consistent across all sectors, but perhaps we see it quite acutely in the legal sector because we are a sort of one based in natural language. We love pens, we love papers, and we love physicality, whether it's a courtroom or a diligence, sort of physical diligence room. So sort of a lot of work we have to do is just some of that really basic stuff around improving some of those practices around good data collection. And yes, it's in terms of actually overcoming some of those and how we've managed to sort of battle through some of those challenges and creating the ecosystem we have with LawtechUK is, I think, it goes sort of having a really sort of central driving force. And all the sort of people represented on this panel, I'm sure, represent that for their own sectors. I think having that sort of convener and central driving force is key. And yeah, already mentioned, I guess, around having a sort of alignment around purpose, really clear objectives and sort of objectives and outcomes for that data ecosystem. If you really want action, not just words. And I think, yeah, and last again, Vincenzo and many others have already mentioned, it's just having the sort of, I guess, the right people around the table. It's involving all the right stakeholders. And that doesn't just mean, you know, having the right organizations or bodies. It's actually thinking about the people within those organization and bodies. Like, do you have the right level of seniority in terms of sponsorship, who can offer that advocacy, that influencing role? But you also need, you know, the people, the experts on the ground as well. So think in terms of, yeah, delivering on an ecosystem, those, yeah, three things are key.
Thank you. No, I think, you know, politics and power, again, are really important, you know, within institutions, as you say, between institutions, absolutely critical here. I'm interested that we are 26 minutes into the panel, and it's the first time somebody's mentioned just an actual lack of data itself, which is really interesting, and I think very different to how we might have had this conversation a few years ago. Louisa.
Thanks. I'd just like to say to Simon, we're always happy to talk to weather nerds or any other kinds of nerds. It's what makes us happy.
I'll take you up on that.
Yeah, definitely. And also with Alex, I think one of the things that's been really interesting over the past few years has been the growth of natural language processing, which turns all those words, because government has a lot of words stored in places, but we now have the technology to be able to turn some of those words into data that's useful and can help give us greater insights, which is something that, again, quite excites me. But I was going to say something about the challenges. I think data sharing, we all know data sharing can be quite a long process, and it involves making sure that we have trust between the people whose data, the people who the data is about, the people who own the data, and what we're going to do with the data. And that's a mix of legal, technical, and ethical solutions. And you do need all of those in order to do the data sharing. Really important, particularly for interoperability and to be able to do the good, exciting data science stuff, is to get your foundations right, to get the plumbing right. This is about having good data standards and making sure you can recruit data architects and data engineers, which is also a challenge sometimes, getting the right skills in. I think, again, on getting hold of data and finding things that are of value to both parties. So we've been working more with the private sector, and that might be about, they might have data, we might be able to share some skills with them, we might look at their data in a different way or produce an output that's useful to them. It comes back to that idea of shared goals and understanding that those goals might be quite different between us as ONS and somebody in the private sector, but where we can work together.
Thank you. Thank you so much. No, really interesting. So when you started talking, I started 2 columns on the in my notebook here on the barriers, and one was technical and one was human. And we now, which is interesting, we have 3 barriers, I think, that I was trying to summarize in the technical and 7 in the human column, which I think shows us how, you know, an ecosystem is about people, it's about power, it's about accountability, relationships, trust, and capacity. These are not just sort of amorphous, you know, relationship things. There are some very practical things too about capacity, about the access to resources among different institutions and so on. And then there are actual technical issues here around data interoperability, around methodologies, around the data itself, the lack of data, the suitability of data for addressing different issues. So I hope Alex Coley, who asked a question a few minutes ago about a magic wand, if you could wave a magic wand, is there something you could fix that would make your ecosystem better? I hope you, I think what you might and others might take away from this session is that it's going to have to be quite a big wand. But that I think, you know, what I was interested in also was how much shared, sort of how much of these different issues were shared. I think there's a huge amount, as one of you said, of learning that can happen across ecosystems. And it feels like there really is starting to be quite a strong common agenda and understanding about the components of a good system. And we are, you know, sharing these ideas and so on with each other as we go. So I hope that this has been at least the beginning of thinking about how data ecosystems can, as they obviously clearly are in all the sectors represented here, play such a critical role in helping governments, the private sector, and all of us as individuals to understand and then to act on some of the very big challenges that we collectively face. Thank you all so much for that really, really interesting panel. Really, really enjoyed that and learned a lot myself. I hope you enjoyed it in the audience. Yeah, wishing you all a very, very good afternoon. Enjoy the rest of the summit. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mac.
Thank you.